As noble citizens, we must bypass a life of dormancy and vice to pursue the generative endeavor of a hard day's work. The benefits of these pursuits are not secured by chance or charity, but through the merit of your character and the firmness of your convictions. It is you who are planting the seeds of trees whose shade you know you shall never see.
I'm glad my dog showed up so we could get some nice ambient sounds that the listener can wonder about. And
Are the dog sound effects supposed to be part of it, or no?
No, it's just
Sometimes.
broken wind style. It's how we do things on this show. But hey, it's your host, Butler, the super producer Vane, and we're back in Florida.
Back in Florida, part 3. Very excited about this one. We're covering chapter 4 and chapter 5 of the book Finding Florida. Chapter 4 called The Fort, Not the Fountain, and chapter 5 called The West Florida Butterfly Effect. The book is broken up in a little bit different way than the way that we're covering this, but we believe that there's a good cohesiveness to chapters 4 and 5.
Well, I was thinking about it too before we hopped on. This is where we do really start to get into the meat of a narrative. Because I think we spent a lot of the first part of the book talking about things that are interesting and must be appreciated about the state of Florida, the prehistory, the ecology, the indigenous genocide, setting the scene. And this is where we get to actually the perpetual failure of Spanish colonialism in Spain too. We talked about that, and it's
in general,
that's not gonna that's gonna continue. That's an evergreen theme.
That's true. This is going to be familiar. Some parts are going to be familiar to what we talked about in part 1, where part 2 is more the prehistory.
And the myth. That's the other thing I was thinking about too. Is we talked a lot about the myth
of the Fountain of Youth, but we're actually getting into documented historical
into the real. We're getting into much more things as they did happen. And I wanted to say too, I think at the top of the episode again, just pick up the T.D. Allman book and read it if you get the time, because this is another, like you were saying, this is a great chapter, and it really he has a great sense of scene and a great sense of letting something speak for itself rather than having to tell you what to think about it. And the observations he does make are very poignant. So I'm excited to get started. So once again, we'll try not to just read the book, but the first thing I think we have to do is introduce Pedro Menendez de Avilas. Yes. And what we are going to be talking about here is the real founding of St. Augustine. We've sort of talked a little bit about St. Augustine as a place and Matanzas and all that, but we're going to talk about what actually happened now.
It wasn't actually Ponce de Leon and the Fountain of Youth. The true founder is arguably Menendez de Aviles. And so we can get into some of his background.
Well, I'll say, too, for the listener, the other reason that my co-host and I are so excited to get into this section as well is that we get to really get into some European political history and theological conflict, which is the kind of stuff that we really groove on.
And it's going to be familiar to people, in modern politics.
Yes, exactly. People have a frame of reference for that.
Right. I think it'll feel incredibly relevant in this moment of politics.
I agree.
Where we see bad faith continuously. Not to date this episode too much, but I think you recognize bad faith politics at this time that we're recording this episode.
Well, we're going to talk about chivalry soon too, but
the age of chivalry.
Was it something? There's something else I was thinking about. We're going to obviously be talking, I'm not obviously, but we're going to be talking, get ready for it, Treaty of Tordesillas. You know it. We hope you. And I was thinking before we got on that, that's actually such an incredibly significant world document that isn't mega relevant in a lot of North America.
Yeah.
But in Florida, it is hugely important for why Florida is the way it is.
Right.
And specifically, actually, the breakdown of the legitimacy of the Treaty of Tordesillas
Yeah.
is what is a lot of the story of Florida.
Yeah, it's not understood
way.
enough in the context of the Protestant Reformation, I think, in the connection that's made with that it's really Protestants beginning to purposefully ignore the word of all of Christendom, the Pope, and they're saying, nah, I don't agree. I think I can trade in the Americas if I say so. And they start coming over. And so even the myth that Protestants came over only for religious freedom, I think you find a recognizable degree of being entirely contained within the Anglosphere, and that has its own bias towards the English or Anglican view, and actually much more of the reason, or at least arguably as much of a reason why people first came to America, was not just religious freedom, but also self-interest.
Religious conquest.
Yeah, they wanted to go over and conquer, and they didn't like the arrangement that only Portugal and Spain could go to the New World, and they were each given their own monopolistic control over the new territory. And Protestants disagreed with that ultimately and started to this is the age of pirates too, and the reason we'll see why piracy is so critical to the formation of early European statehood. As we'll talk about the drama of European politics, you'll see why piracy was so important to them, to be able to operate, to do the functions they wanted of a state, but also in secrecy, and to have some amount of deniability for what they were doing.
Yeah, and piracy is very much part of the identity of the Floridian to this day. And there's, like whole regions of Florida where the pirates or whatever the hell they are, that Tampa Bay team. But yeah, right. Like, it's not a insignificant part of the culture, and this is like part of where that comes from. And all this is happening in the 16th century, and just to return it to the text, Pedro Menendez de Avilas is killing 100 plus Frenchmen in Fort Caroline. Yeah, on the near Jacksonville area, basically where modern day St. Augustine will be. And this is the actual true, gritty, nasty story of why St. Augustine is where it is, and it's Spanish colonial history specifically. It had to do with their determination to rid this part of their holdings, given to them by the Pope, of these French Huguenot bastards. So that was what they were doing. And Pedro, I gotta say, the portrait of Pedro Menendez de Avila that is given to us by T.D. Allman is fantastic. Such a bloodthirsty psychopath. Just an absolute lunatic. Holy shit. And just constantly doing psycho shit.
Yeah, we can talk about his upbringing. He's born in 1519.
Right.
And he ultimately dies in 1574.
Right.
And he orders the first mass slaughter of white men by white men. So it's Spanish on French violence, because the French are settling there, and he doesn't like that. And so, as we said, he goes on to slaughter first 130 plus people, and then another 110 people. And as Allman says in the chapter, this is actually the first documented historical event in what will become the United States territory.
Right.
Not tripping over a fountain of youth, not any of this mythological stuff.
Yeah.
This is actually the first event. And Menendez is hardly mentioned in the historiography. You don't see his name anywhere, but you do see...
Besides the Matanzas that you see in St. Augustine.
Like Matanzas, which is very common.
Which is so great of him to pick up on. And one of the things he says here, that I want to, if I could pull a quote, is for generations it would be part of the national orthodoxy that the conquest of the New World marked deliverance from crimes and corruptions of the Old World. But as Menendez demonstrated, American history would be morally indistinguishable from Europe. From Florida to Quebec to Bunker Hill to Shiloh to Appomattox, and then a U.S. power expanding to Veracruz and San Juan Hill, the history of the future United States, starting with Florida, would be a replication of Europe's blood feuds, a tale of dispossession written in blood. And we will return to the scene of Menendez in the French fort because it's a really insane story, and it just sort of seems like his style from the portrait we get of him here. So get back to his sort of biography a little bit. I wanted to get that quote.
Yeah, sure. And that event, too, that we talk about, Allman also mentions, it's not only the first event to happen in the United States territory, it's also the first to be expunged from Florida's history for violating future notions of what the past should have been.
Right.
But yeah, to move on to Menendez's biography, he's one of 19 children. He kissed Mary Tudor's hands, which apparently would have been pretty significant at the time because she was royalty. He was painted by the artist Titian. Also, he's a prisoner of the Inquisition, and he was a runaway at the age 14, learning to sail, and then became a notable pirate hunter. He becomes commissioned by the Habsburg Emperor Charles V, the Spanish emperor, to rid the seas for Spain. And this really ties into what we were saying about the Treaty of Tordesillas and the breakdown of it. In theory...
And just, the religious wars of this period.
Yeah, there's a quote that says, "In theory, these attacks on the ships of rival nations should have been unnecessary. Florida, along with the whole of North America, was supposed to be Spain's exclusive preserve. But the Pope's bisection of the globe was workable only so long as obedient Catholics were the only ones at large in the watery world before Europe. It was a situation that couldn't last because the Age of Discovery coincided with revolutionary changes in Europe's religious landscape. In 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 thesis to the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral. Simultaneously, the growing power of France, England, and the Netherlands created an increasingly nationalist challenge to Spanish supremacy. In Florida's case, ideological fanaticism was added to the great power hostility because France, like England but unlike Spain, encouraged its religious dissidents to establish New World colonies. What the Pilgrims were to New England, France's Huguenots were to Florida. Heretics, as well as aggressors, so far as Menendez was concerned.
I have some Huguenot background too, but...
Whoa, pretty cool. You're a heretic to Spain as well.
Right. I mean, aren't we all at some point? But
we're not pure.
I think that's a cool thing to point out is like there's a sense of simultaneousness we often lose in history when we're looking at it. And I think it's really cool to realize that Martin Luther and the Reformation were ongoing at the same time that colonization was happening in Florida. And that, like, those things happening simultaneously kind of, like, I don't know if people think about that always.
Right, yeah, and I just joked a little bit about the religious purity, but that actually is the way that the Spanish Empire, which was the largest empire under feudalism at the time, that was really, unlike what we'll see becomes white supremacy, and this becomes a major central point, I guess, of what a lot of we're going to talk about with the different worlds and the different nations that were trying to grab a piece of this country beforehand.
Right.
There were actually so many different ideologies here before there came to be the Anglican white supremacist ideology.
Yes.
And we'll talk more about how the evolution of even the concept of whiteness starts to form under the emerging Protestant Reformation.
Absolutely.
But prior to that, it's really not about the Spanish conceived of whiteness as being really your religious purity and your adherence to good Catholicism.
Right. Catholics thought about whiteness, but in a different way.
Yeah, you're strict. So you could look very different in Spanish colonies and be treated with respect as long as you were a good Catholic. And those families would generally be more white, but they also didn't have the sense of purity that would form later on under the English Empire.
Right. Well, there's also a lot of like the creation of nationalism that we're out talking about here too. I'm actually re-listening a little bit to Hell on Earth by the Chapo Boys, and that is really one of the end results of the Reformation of the 30 Years War period, is that people stopped thinking of themselves as part of the kingdom of God and thinking of themselves as a part of the kingdom of France, and not even necessarily the monarchy even, always. Yeah. Although the monarchy is very important in this story.
The battle cries evolve, I believe they say in Hell on Earth. They talk about how the battle cries will evolve from, for Maria or for Cristo or things like that to now for Spain or for France. And that is the formation of nationality. And the scale of death only increases exponentially as this evolution happens. Certainly lots of people are killed in the name of religion, but ultimately the scale of death only increases under the emerging nation states, and that's, as we get into the modern warfare and the shock of World War I and mass industry of death, that's one of the things of modernity that was so shocking.
Right, and now what T.D. Allman gets into next in the text, and we're, again, going to try and resist the urge to just read the book, but he tells the story of the sort of imperial intrigue that eventually leads to the Spanish having a re-interest in Florida, because it's already understood pretty quickly that Florida is not the, cash cow that the Spanish may have hoped it was, and they certainly had other colonies that were doing better at that time. And it's like no exaggeration, too, that the Spanish monarchy has some pretty fail moments in its history, and King Philip is, I think, one of those. But
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, he ends up in a situation where King Henry of France has died, and Catherine de' Medici becomes the regent of France. And
a feud begins.
He is facing a strategic rival.
Yeah, and that's his mother-in-law.
And even though for 50 years before this series of events that leads to King Philip needing to give a shit about Florida again, he is quoted in the book as saying, "Florida's shoreline was too low and sandy, her countryside too poor in resource, and her harbors too barred and shallow to permit practicable settlement.
Yeah.
The king banned further expedition to the accursed land of Florida." And then, Catherine de' Medici, being the more, ambitious regent than perhaps her predecessor, allows the Huguenots to go establish their colony in Florida, and all of a sudden, all of their calculations change, and they have to send their craziest dude to go and try and do something about it.
Yeah, and that's Menendez. So they send Menendez racing in what Allman calls basically a Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse. So instead of being afraid of this territory really close to them, they're highly concerned about this faraway territory that, as you said in that quote, only a few years before that, really, they're saying is completely useless. They can't find any practical reason to own this land, and it's just costing them money, and all their ventures out there were just a giant waste of money, is what it seems. And they're holding on to this territory and feeling that way.
Yeah, that gets underscored. But I think another thing I sort of get from the portrait of de Aviles we get from this chapter as well is that you really do get the sense that whether it was Catholic or Protestant, New World colonialism was very much a way for these people to vent their craziest guys and to just sort of have something for them to do. Because, this man is so, just impulsive. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So, like the 1565 attack on Fort Caroline, the 1702 destruction of St. Augustine had its origins in the complications of mammalian reproduction as played out in the life cycles of members of the Spanish royal family. The remarkable Philip II begat the unexceptional Philip III, who begat the incompetent Philip IV. Philip IV, in turn, produced an heir in the form of the future Carlos II, who was both physically and mentally incompetent to fulfill his dynastic responsibilities. His abnormally large tongue, which made his speech unintelligible, and his dining habits unspeakable, Spaniards believed, had to be the work of the devil, hence his nickname, El Hejixado, the Bewitched. Carlos II begat nobody. The dereliction of dynastic duty amidst the tinderbox of rivalries of Europe, and, considering Spain's enfeebled but far-flung place in the world, was tantamount to provoking a world war. Carlos II's airless death on the 1st of November 1700 set off a struggle for the throne of Spain, which the Bourbons ultimately won, but only after Spain had been devastated, and people all over the world killed and maimed because the last Spanish Habsburg monarch had, apparently, an insufficient sperm count. St. Augustine's destruction by England's American colonists was one side effect of this royal dysfunction. So, Philip II was married 4 times, and the third time, his latest marriage to a French princess named Elizabeth Valois was ill-omened from the start. And during his prenuptial celebrations, the child bride's father, King Henry II of France, was horribly wounded and died an excruciating death when a sliver of wood from an adversary's lance pierced his eye and lodged in his brain in the course of the jousting match, leaving his crafty Florentine widow, Catherine de' Medici, to run a show as regent of France. And so that's where this rivalry, which is really a royal feud, begins, and she races to grab the territory of Florida. And now suddenly, even though they formerly thought this land is useless, it causes Philip II to send Menendez over, only assuming that Catherine de' Medici must know something that he doesn't about the land. And that really is the formative moment of Florida, and really why this chapter is called The Fort, Not the Fountain, because it's not the myth about the Fountain of Youth that explains what happened in Florida. It's really the forts that were set up and the assumption that if forts are built, there must be some kind of surplus lying behind that fort. And so the suspicion emerged that is so deeply European feudal and ultimately goes on to lead to the 30 Years' War and then all the other world wars. It really is the underlying reason of all war are these feudalistic competitions that end up forming, and the overreach of executive authority that ultimately starts to happen, and the bad faith politics that then ensues behind hiding that. And that's gonna clearly become a theme as we talk about what goes on in Florida and as we continue to tell this story.
So King Philip sends his craziest boy out across the ocean, who he's already been using, I think my co-host already mentioned, to clear heretics from the ocean for him already in, the more close to home regions. So Menendez takes off on this insane pace across the ocean. He's leaving boats behind. Yep. He's throwing fucking cannons in the ocean.
He throws his probably priceless bronze cannons out of the boat because there's a storm, and he's worried.
This is October in Florida,
Yeah, it's October in Florida, so expect that there are going to be storms, but he's still racing there to beat the French, assuming that they know something about the land that he doesn't.
You get this real sense of, frenetic insanity, because the other thing T.D. Allman underscores, too, is that he's got a plan to go look for his son who has disappeared, and he just says, nah, f*** that. I have to stop the French for the Spanish crown. And it's like, dude.
Yeah, he gives up looking for his son, and
this is almost the 17th century. This is I don't know. So and the other important detail too is that the thing that's I think interesting is it's like you have this guy who has clearly a talent for riding around the ocean in a boat f***ing people up, and that's kind of an interesting thing in itself, that he's just really good at going around with his boat and getting near other people on their boats and fucking them up. And like when you read about the logistics of naval battles, they are crazy. And it's like you can imagine he probably was like a pretty skilled, interesting guy, but he just keeps being handed more and more distance. Right. And so when he's told to go across the fucking Atlantic Ocean, he's just taking it with the same manic intensity. But it's like, dude, it's the Atlantic Ocean.
And I think you can see that manic intensity, as we've talked about in the first episode, how these early ventures really go on to become much like modern business ventures, and that erratic unwillingness to ever get trapped in a corner is very much, it's a psychotic characteristic that you can really see in Allman's writing about Menendez. And
dude, he's a disruptor.
For sure. It really, you can see it in the idea even of, well, we're going to cross through to the North Atlantic Passage. We're going to get to the east by sailing west. And even that idea is kind of erratic, but he sort of goes on to show how that is a idea.
How many days
Menendez.
does it take him? I can't remember what it is. It's like it's a pretty impressive voyage. And
he did it repeatedly, over and over. Like that wasn't his first voyage across the Atlantic.
Yeah, you're right, because he had lost his son already in that like region. Yeah, but one thing is that he sailed across with this fleet, pushing it to the pedal to the floor, and he doesn't stop in the Spanish colony of Cuba to resupply and make his shit look a little better. He's too locked in on going to kill these Frenchmen in the St. John's River area.
Right. Yeah, and so he finally makes it there, only to find that the French had actually beat him there, and this is where the character Jean Ribault, the French pirate, basically enters the scene. And so Menendez realizes that he's arrived there just behind Ribault, and they've already unloaded. And so even though he's raced there, the French already made it there first, and his whole strategy had rested on getting there before the reinforcements got there, which was Ribault.
It's so funny.
So, now he realizes, he realizes that his element of surprise is gone because they see him there. Exactly. If he can see them, then obviously they can see him out at the harbor, and he was planning to get there first. And so this completely destroys his plan.
Up, his ships are in terrible shape.
Yeah, but again, there's this idea to him that he thinks if nobody else would ever do this, then actually it's a really smart thing to do. And
this seems to be the only way he thinks.
Yeah, the only way he thinks is outside the box and thinking well, if everybody else would find this incredibly irrational, then actually it must be truly rational. We'll get west by sailing east.
This story strikes me as you're racing to try and get the jump on your opponent, and then by the time you get to the place you think you're going to surprise them, they're already there. They have their weapons pointed at you, and your is out. That's kind of how this feels like. Is that he shows up,
yes,
and it's just in terrible circumstances immediately. And it's really, really funny.
Yeah, and so here's a good quote. It says, his whole strategy had rested on destroying the French settlement before the reinforcements got there. Now, since the French could see him as clearly as he could see them, Menendez had lost the element of surprise as well as the race to get to Fort Caroline first. Instead of attacking, expediency now dictated that he and his fleet withdraw. For one thing, Menendez had not established his own Florida base of operations. His heavily laden, storm-battered ships were full of men, beasts, and provisions needing disembarkation after months at sea. To Menendez, such considerations were no more than cannons to be jettisoned into the storm. He had come here to attack the French. Attack them he resolved to do, there and then. He and his ships went advancing on the French as night fell, and once again fate mocked him. The wind died, causing him to improvise yet another plan. He calculated correctly, it turned out, that if, instead of trying to escape, he let his becalmed ships go on drifting, his Spanish fleet and Ribault's French fleet in a series of uncontrollable encounters and collisions, would become entangled in the moonless darkness. That calamity, Menendez had decided, was just what he wanted, because then, at first light, he and his Spaniards could spring from their ships, board the French ships, and kill the heretics. In the night, sound carried over the water as the Spaniards and French shouted imprecations at each other. Why wait for the morning, the French taunted. So Menendez ordered his boarding parties to attack then and there, producing still another calamity, for it was as though Menendez had signaled the French, not his own. In unison, the French ship raised their sails, taking advantage of the returning breeze, slipped out of reach into the dark safety of the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, I mean, again, we must resist the urge to just read the book, but it is a
nice
fail scene. And so they get away from him there, and you got to remember too that like these guys are also Ribault's crew is also they've unloaded and everything, they've like been there, but they're still like just people from the fucking 16th century who've sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, so they're not in the best position either. Although they certainly have the drop on Menendez at this point. And this is also, I mean, again, the age of chivalry still on some level. So
right.
There's a certain amount of
diplomacy.
Grace and expectation.
Yeah,
that diplomacy that people are going to grant each other. At least that's how they see it. So, all right. So that's going on. Okay, so that attack. I'm trying to read where that attack continues. So the French sail away, and because they've unloaded, they're going way faster. Their ships are lighter. Once again, it's like you didn't prepare, and now they're gonna you're gonna make me look like an idiot.
Cargo, so they're going much faster.
Mm-hmm.
And Menendez has no local base of operations, only this one Spanish outpost in Havana that's more than a week away, and it's secretive.
Right.
And so he's worried.
So when the French ship's gone, he decides that they're going to attack Fort Caroline, actually. And they get all set up to do that, but they had left other ships to protect the fort.
Yeah, so the French, you mean, had left. Yeah, so Ribault
leaves, exactly.
But it's actually a little bit of a surprise because he leaves three ships behind that are actually there to defend, and they're ready when Menendez and the Spanish arrive at Fort Caroline. They're not caught off guard, which Menendez was hoping.
And it's kind of hard to describe in a podcast form, but like basically what has happened because of where Fort Caroline is that he's sailed into this estuary, into this bay, and now because they've reinforced that fort and set up like ships on the ocean and people on land, they have their rickety ass boat that has no real supply lines or anything, and they're also more or less boxed into this estuary. Like they can't really escape very easily at this point.
Yeah.
And now, like, because of the secret street, no one knows Menendez is there. Like he's in. This is where the tables have officially turned.
Right. And Menendez had done one smart thing, which was to send his flagship, the San Pelayo, back to Havana.
Yes.
And that ship only barely escapes right before the French could have seized it. And if that ship had been taken, it would have completely bankrupted Menendez. He did not do the smart thing of diversifying his portfolio. Everything was in that one ship. That's why he tossed the cannons and he let 3 ships sink on the way here in the storms with hundreds of men on them, and on his ship jettisoned the cannons off so that he could make sure that he would survive the storm. And again, that goes to the mindset that he had. And so no one thought that he would just go to Fort Caroline and start trying to slaughter all the civilians.
Well, hold on. Here's what happens is that those ships that escaped earlier, they're going after the San Pelayo, it looks like. And he's like, but remember, it's October in Florida, too. So the weather's looking nasty.
Yep.
So
and a storm.
They're basically camped out. Yeah, they're camped out. There's a fucking hurricane going on. And and our boy Menendez is determined to draw blood to fight the heretics. And what does he do in those situations? He does what no one thinks he'll do.
Yeah, he constantly tries to do the unthinkable, and so it says the very irrationality of his latest scheme to march overland through unknown territory in order to attack the French in the midst of a hurricane was its most rational feature. If Menendez could sneak up on Fort Caroline from behind, the French would have no inkling of the Spaniards' approach until the moment they were attacked.
Yeah, exactly. And so in a hurricane conditions, through a 3-day hike in pre-industrialized Florida.
Obviously his men are pissed.
Assholes.
And he's just like essentially whipping them and forcing them through just sheer violence across to march through the muck and rain to sneak up on Fort Caroline, even though his men are tired, hungry, complaining, tormented by insects. And and ultimately they arrive. Obviously they're pissed off now and bloodthirsty, and that's where this massacre happens, where no Spaniards die because they took the French so by surprise. And they bludgeoned or stabbed 132 people in close quarters to death. And 45 Frenchmen managed to escape by swimming for their lives and boarding 2 small ships, which they sail all the way across the Atlantic. And among the few survivors was Ribault's son.
I think it's always worth underscoring. I'm sorry to cut you off, but one thing I always feel like it's worth mentioning too when you're talking about like people doing insane shit like this, and the crew. You mentioned the crew as well being forced to do this with him as well, and that got me thinking about how at this time, basically before the French Revolution and like the Napoleonic era, forced conscription, you just can't imagine how normal it was that your life was being forced to do the worst shit ever at like threat of death by the monarchs of the country you live in, like being basically slowly coerced by poverty into circumstances where you would have to just be the guy having to stomp through Florida. It's just a job. Yeah, it's like, look, I mean, this guy's really insane, but he's always got a job. So here I am fucking stomping through Florida to go kill some heretics in a hurricane. So yeah, I don't know, because I just think that's always worth like remembering about like why like people did things then. It's like because Menendez would kill them if they didn't do what he was, you know what I mean? Like that was like normal for that. Like, God, it's just crazy.
Yeah, and so now having chased the San Pelayo, Ribault and his ships in the storm
But this was chivalry too, by the way, what I'm saying. Still the age of chivalry. It's like compelling your lessers, fine. Chivalrous. Like that was cool and chivalrous. But sorry to cut you off.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, and so then basically chasing the San Pelayo, Ribault's ships are shipwrecked during the storm. And so now they're scattered across the Matanzas Inlet all the way up to the Daytona Beach, up to Cape Canaveral. And there are scattered survivors all over the place, and they are castaways. And so there's this quote here. It says, "These castaways had been marching north for days, but south of St. Augustine they reached an impasse. The tidal channel was too wide and deep for the French to cross without a boat. As they pondered this dilemma, Menendez and his troops appeared on the opposite side of the inlet. 2 French officers were brought across to parley. The Spanish informed them of Fort Caroline's capture, but assured them that their commander, who was a humane and merciful man, had sent the French survivors to France in a well-provisioned ship."
Well, I think we have to, I don't know if we underscored that they got back there and they killed him. They did not, like, they got in there and slit their throats.
They parlay, they give them the promise that they're going, they tell them that Fort Caroline has been captured, but they said that the commander was humane and merciful, and that they sent the French home in a well-provisioned ship, which was a lie.
I meant Fort Caroline. They killed them at Fort Caroline. Yeah, I think we forgot to mention it, but like they go through that 3-day hurricane trek to slit the throats of the Frenchmen at Fort Caroline. That's those 100+ people we talked about at the start of the episode.
And then they'll go on again to kill 110 of Ribault's men who are shipwrecked all across the shore.
Yeah.
And so, Menendez opted for deceit. He gave them a promise under his seal that he would preserve the lives of Ribault and his men faithfully, without fraud, as an honorable gentleman. And a few prudent ones among them, unwilling to trust the Spaniards, turned back, but the majority, including Ribault, accepted his offer of clemency. And then once in Spanish hands, the survivors were tied in groups of 4, back to back, and Ribault and his men were stabbed.
Yeah, this is where the chivalry thing we were talking about earlier comes back to. Like, this really was an era where chivalry
was totally dead.
It was the end of this era, but chivalry really meant something for these people for a very long time, and this is a moment that would be known in Europe as part of where people stopped believing in that bullshit.
Yeah, and so Menendez ordered all these men killed, and only 4 of them survived, who happened to be the drummers, who Menendez ordered to play everybody to their death, which is pretty horrific. He marched them.
This dude was a fucking
marched them to drummers with drummers behind them, and those 4 drummers were the only ones that he let survive, and he wasted no bullets or gunpowder, and that's why he ordered them stabbed or bludgeoned to death. And
same time calling them Lutherans and enemies of God and the Virgin. So that important too, like we said, it's still European religious conflicts too. Like this is, we get the image in the Northeastern portrait of the settling of America as like it was said earlier in the chapter, a place where Americans escaped the religious conflicts of Europe. And the story of Florida is in fact the place where these conflicts continued and took on a new form and chivalry died. And I think that's also fair.
And now 14 miles south of St. Augustine today, if you drive down Route A1A, you can see the Fort Matanzas National Monument, where Matanzas lured his victims to their death, which is now a restaurant and
Menendez
a motel.
did, yeah.
Yeah, where Menendez did. He killed Ribault and his men, and this was a human encounter back then that really represented 2 different worlds, the Spanish and the French, who had 2 entirely different ideas of what
Catholic
they would do with this continent. And interestingly, also, Allman points out that these men came here both with their own personal ambitions for empire, and neither one of them would ever see their sons again, but for completely different reasons. Menendez technically won by murdering all these Frenchmen, but he actually lost his son forever when he completely gave up searching for them.
Right, exactly.
Then Ribault loses his son because he's murdered, and his son manages to escape and become one of the few survivors from this incident. And then
and this went on to be a scandal in Europe, which is, I think, crazy to think about, that there were, in the 16th century, moments where the goings-on of European colonizers would be scandalizing all of Europe, but it's I think something we often forget here in America.
This is where politics is recognizable, even under the feudal era, that politics that we see today of human relationships and social relations, where ultimately they wait 1 month before bringing up this horrific atrocity, but ultimately King Philip avoids discussing it for 1 month. But then there is this quote where he says, when opportunity arose, the ambassador...
That's the French ambassador,
Yeah, the French ambassador dresses down the king and he says, I have borne arms for 40 years, Raymond de Fourquevaux, Seigneur of Beccarie, informed the monarch, and in that time the forces of the 2 crowns have often combated each other, but never once has such an execrable deed occurred.
Hilarious, so French.
Yeah, the Spanish king could have retorted that France's internal wars of religion had led to the killings of many more heretics than his soldiers killed, or the Inquisition burned at the stake. Instead, Philip blandly informed the ambassador that he too was distressed that the matter had come, as it had, to the shedding of blood. Then the Spanish king added a telling comment. The intruding colonists, he observed, were heretics who obviously had gone to Florida without the approval of the French government. Therefore, he told the French ambassador, exemplary punishment had been justified in order to deter future trespassing. In this manner, the king artfully turned the tables on the French. Did they wish to condone or even claim responsibility for the supposed misdeeds of some criminal heretics?
It's a very sorry, not sorry answer. It's very there's the death of a sort of style of diplomacy into a more bad faith one, like you've talked about. So
exactly.
There's a great example of that.
Modern politics forming in real time, essentially.
In Florida.
And it's essentially the invention of lying, which is a theme that I think I'm going to keep saying.
Certainly,
I mean, it's not truly, and of course, this isn't really the invention of
the big
politicians.
Lie. Yeah.
But it is a formative moment after the collapse of the Roman Empire and the collapse of empires in the wake of the Middle Ages, where there are no such things. This is the formative moment of kind of restarting that in action and having what the ancient Greeks would have called classical tyranny. That when you have private actors with so much private wealth that they can start to put so much power into the executive authority of one fiefdom, this is where conflict starts to emerge and lead to world wars.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he makes parallels early in the chapter to Florida being a sort of Cuban Missile Crisis between the French and Spanish at this point in their ideological struggle for who gets the lucre of the new world, and they, feeling entitled to it already, have decided to abandon this position that they then realize they can't abandon because then the heretics might take it and it won't be theirs anymore. So They can't live with the thought of that. And that's, very Christian. It's very, very generous to want to own God's creation, but that's the, Rome flavor.
Yeah, then Allman moves on to the hasty choice of the site for St. Augustine, which limited its possibilities. And that's why Jacksonville becomes the first metropolis, because it's actually a better suited capital. But it was really Menendez's frantic behavior that led to the quick choice of St. Augustine as the place that he would settle. So there again is the irrationality behind even the settlement here, that the lasting Spanish settler who will become the first permanent settler of Florida he settles it sort of in the wrong spot.
Yeah. I mean, that's just a classic Florida fail for you. We get at the end of this paragraph, too, the length of his voyage. June 27th, 1565 is when he left Cadiz. And then by August 28th, he had gotten to America. So like a month across the Atlantic in the 16th century. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, so St. Augustine owes its existence to Menendez, but there are no statues or monuments to him.
Right.
Of course, it's all to Ponce de Leon.
Right.
And the hint of what he did in Spanish Matanza is still hidden there beneath the surface, because Matanza means slaughter or to kill, which is why it's related to matador, and also to the Sanskrit verb which means to kill, which has a trace of its meaning in the word checkmate or checkmata. And this was Spain checking the first French ambitions, basically, in Florida. And it's also the first great historical event in what will become United States territory. The speed that this happens is also very impressive. And there's a
quote that's what
here.
I was just covering there. But
yeah, there's a quote here that I think is important to include where he says, "What's still impressive is how fast Menendez made it happen.
Yeah.
If in the said coast or land there be settlers or corsairs of other nations whatsoever not subject to us, drive them out by what means you see fit," was how the king defined his mission. Menendez sailed from Cadiz on June 27, 1568. By August 28th, he had sighted Florida. He had hunted the French down by September 4th. By October 11th, the date of the final massacre, and the French power in Florida had been crushed.
So the Menendez quote that comes later on there too that I wanted to get to before we, I guess, move out of chapter 4 is Menendez basically warned the king that Florida was gonna be important, even though T.D. Allman makes a good light of the phrase he uses in that quote, which is, let me read it. So if the French or English should come to settle Florida, Menendez warned the king, it would be the greatest inconvenience, as much for the mines and territories of New Spain, which is parts of what comes Mexico, as for the navigation and trade of China and Malacca. If that arm of the sea goes to the South Sea, as is certain, which I believe is what he's saying there, is basically they're talking about there being a connection.
They're completely wrong. It doesn't go there. And he says that too, that they're looking, the real Holy Grail is the non-existent Northwest Passage, which does not exist. And he points out how Menendez kept searching for this mythical body of water, even though more than 50 years earlier, in 1511, the Peter Martyr map, which we talked about in episode 1, already showed that the American continents established a massive north to south barrier of ambitions for sailing east by sailing west because of the Panama Isthmus that ultimately will become the Panama Canal. You cannot easily circumnavigate around North America to get to China. So it was a massive waste of time until they were able to achieve something like the Panama Canal.
So much of this, as is the case when you're looking at these, like we said earlier about these being early states, this being early nationalism, is part of it being too these places dealing with those impulses for expansion and conquest that are first played out through the Crusades and the Reconquista and things like that. And that's something they point out in Hell on Earth. That's a really interesting observation, is that colonialism of the New World began right around the end of all of the crusading happening. And T.D. Allman also makes that parallel in this story that Menendez was, let me find this, in the interval, the Spanish conquest of the Americas, which had begun as an extension of the Reconquista of Andalusia from the Muslims, had started to turn into a European great power struggle for control of North and South America. And when you think about it too, it's okay, so the religious mandate that allows you to drive these Muslims out of your country, quote unquote, is that they worship a god you do not recognize or agree with. And it makes sense that you can take that same logic and apply it to North America and say well, these people don't even really count within my conception of humanity unless they accept God. And it's very interesting to see that same force finding its way into Florida as well, but that is very much a part of this story and is a part of the Catholic conquest of this region that you still see very much a lot of, connection to. Catholicism is still pretty big here. Yeah, in the Spanish-speaking world.
Yeah, and we already talked about how that evolution evolves essentially from wars of religion to wars of nationality, and that carries with it a massive scale of increase in death, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
And so then there's another important quote here that talks about the formation of freebooters and pirates in Florida and the formation of a fort there, or something worth fortifying, which ultimately just becomes a tantalizing treat for other nations to try to conquer and to assume that something of value must be guarded behind that fort. So it says, by establishing a Spanish colony in Florida, Menendez created an inviting target for French, English, and later American freebooters to attack. Vengeful Frenchmen raided St. Augustine within 3 years of the massacres. As early as 1586, it was plundered and burned by the English. So the Spanish spent the next few hundred years building and rebuilding a fortress to defend their worthless outpost. Menendez himself quickly went broke. By 1602, royal inquiries were being held as to whether Florida would best be abandoned. The Spanish opted for inertia and raising the walls of the fort a little bit higher.
So I'm going to read a quote here at the end of
Chapter 4 here.
The one about the fort. I'm going to read the last paragraph about the fort because I think it sums everything up really well. Again, trying to resist the urge, just read the book, but it's a good book, guys. And this, again, as so often, there's so many paragraphs in this where T.D. Allman just really nails what Florida is and why it's so hard to describe, and this is a great one. So, by far the most notable structure to have survived from Spanish colonial times in Florida, the Castillo de San Marcos, never has gotten the kind of publicity the Fountain of Youth has. That helps explain why what goes on in Florida is so often so misunderstood. If you take Ponce and the Fountain myth as the beginning, events forever after seem nothing but a series of disconnected, rather silly events. Start with Menendez de Avila's, what he did in Florida, and why he did it, and you begin to perceive an interconnected, comprehensible profile of events, stretching from the Protestant Reformation to the Cuban Missile Crisis and beyond. That pattern consists of power politics and the upheavals of people and products it reflects, along with the role in human affairs of forces commingled with illusion, as wealth and power are both accumulated and squandered. It is the fort, so laboriously and futilely constructed, not the fountain, which tells the truth about Florida and makes what happened there understandable. So that's what's so great about this book. That's what we're trying to do here is help you understand what the heck's going on in this crazy place. And I think one thing we can take away from this chapter for sure is you do really got to understand the Reformation, and you got to understand like those sectional Christian conflicts and religious wars of Europe. It's very important to understanding like the different conceptions of ownership and authority that these people subscribe to and is part of why they were in conflict. You know, not just like the Pope. Right. Not just thinking the Pope is a demon. So we'll move on to
so there's no way we're going to get entirely through chapter 5 because it's actually a little bit bigger than even chapter 4.
It's fine because I didn't reread it as thoroughly.
Yeah,
so
we're gonna do a quick overview of it, and then I think the next episode we'll do a more in-depth dive into chapter 5.
We can come back to it.
But we're going to talk, I think, about the similarities in a broad overview of what chapter 5 is, because chapter 4 just established the historical events and the patterns, and we're going to start seeing how those patterns start to repeat, albeit with maybe some changes here or there, iterations, you know, the whole saying of history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. But ultimately, we're starting to see a lot of the major themes that are forming in the new post-feudal system.
You know what? Honestly, I feel like we've got a pretty good episode here, and I also feel like what's going to happen next is going to be, because what with the portrait we painted is that what we're seeing is not just like it's intercolonial conflict. It's not just like the story of one colonizing nation, like, you know, setting up their colonies and succeeding in spite of the natives' desire to live. It is also a conflict between each other, and that will play out many more times. And the English and the Yankees start to get involved in the next chapter is, I think, the only thing I want to tease.
Yeah, we start to see the same patterns play out, but now the English and the Yankees are going to get involved.
I picked up a primary source. Can I read some of that for the listener? Because it actually covers this section we're going into really nicely. So.
Yeah, definitely. And this chapter 5, is called The West Lone Star Butterfly Effect, which it shows how far off events start to explain the transformation in Florida.
Yeah, and the Lone Star is a symbol we'll come back to, and I kind of want to save all of that because it's some really good stuff.
This idea of far off events going on to influence something, I think an important thing to connect is how it is these feudal relations. It's an incident that happened because of a jousting accident in a marriage between a French and Spanish prince, ultimately, that causes a massacre far off in Florida to happen.
That's a scandal
in Europe.
And
that's the key part. And so it's not insane to take out the chalkboard. Maybe it is a little bit like Charlie Kelly to take out the chalkboard with the red strings, but you can kind of see how these things actually do have a lot of connections from far off places. And that's the idea of the West Florida Lone Star butterfly effect, that things from very far off can go on to explain what is happening in Florida. Perhaps only things very far away can actually be used to explain what is happening in Florida.
Yeah, because everyone here is just trying to chill, man. We're just trying to make it through hurricane season, you know? But let me give you, dear listener, I picked up a nice little primary source while I was out and about in my daily travels because I wanted to diversify the books we're drawing from. And I picked up a book called The Bicentennial Pictorial History of Volusia County by a fellow named Henry B. Watson. And yeah, it's a lot of pictures, so maybe not perfect for podcasting, but the man Henry B. Watson seems to have worked for Daytona Beach Community College, and the intro to this book is really good, and I thought I would read it to just give us some other, maybe less, well-known text added in here, because it reinforces a lot of what T.D. Allman gets to and that we've gotten to already, and sort of teases what we'll get to in the next chapter already. So, the Bicentennial Pictorial History of Volusia County will begin with a brief account of the situation in 1776, and then, through a short text and many pictures, take a look at the years leading up to 1976. In 1776, the American Revolution was in full swing. Great Britain had gained Florida at the close of the French and Indian War in 1763, and Florida was to remain loyal to Britain throughout the Revolution. In the area we now know as Volusia County, there was one settlement, the colony of New Smyrna, which had been established by Dr. Andrew Turnbull in June 1768 at the close of the Revolution. In 1783, Britain returned Florida to Spain, relinquished all claim to her 13 colonies on the east coast of North America, and recognized the independence of this new nation, the United States of America.
And God bless the United States.
A few years after independence, the United States initiated efforts to purchase Florida from Spain, but these efforts were not successful. At that time, the Mississippi River was the western boundary of Florida. In 1810, President James Madison issued a proclamation directing occupation of Florida from the Mississippi River to the Perdido River. However, only the area from the Mississippi to the Pearl River was initially occupied. The official justification for occupation of the territory was based on President Madison's stated opinion that it was part of the Louisiana Purchase. During the War of 1812, other sections of West Florida were occupied. On February 22, 1819, the U.S. Senate ratified the Adams-Onis Treaty between Spain and the United States. The Spanish government, however, delayed their ratification until some of the terms were clarified. It was February 22, 1821, before President James Monroe proclaimed the treaty. Monroe appointed Andrew Jackson as provisional governor and instructed him specifically to do three things. He was to officially receive the territory from Spain, he was to establish a territorial government, and was to govern what was known as the Floridas. It was July 1821 before the formal transfer of West Florida took place at Pensacola. In the same month, the transfer of East Florida was accomplished at St. Augustine. The reason for the delay was an extraordinary amount of bickering between Governor Jackson and the Spanish governor, Jose Calava. Jackson's next official action was to establish a government for the territory of Florida, not the Floridas. Although the British, when they held Florida from 1763 to 1783, and the Spanish during their second era from 1783 to 1821, had established separate governments for East Florida and West Florida, the United States never planned on two Floridas. Jackson now divided Florida into two counties, Escambia, which reached from the Perdido River on the west of the Suwannee River on the east, and St. Johns County, which included all the areas east of the Suwannee, including the Keys. Pensacola was the county seat of Escambia County, and St. Augustine was the seat of St. Johns County. So that's, the place we were just talking about, St. Augustine.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's a great quote that really does cover a lot of what we're going to talk about.
There's one more. I'm trying to read through this, see if there's more I want to get to. Yeah, so hold on. This is the thing I wanted to get to. In this section, I know this is a lot, but it gets to the sort of ineffable and hard to pin down nature of Florida history because of all of these intersecting influences washing over each other and intermingling constantly. Things become very difficult to trace the etymology of, and there'll be a tie into that. So in 1824, the Legislative Council established a county which received the unattractive but appropriate name of Mosquito County. The northern boundary was slightly north of the Matanzas Inlet, and the county extended down the Atlantic coast to Jupiter Inlet. It has been described as 190 miles long and 60 miles broad. The present-day Volusia County was included in this area. St. Augustine continued as the county seat of St. Johns County and was also the county seat for Mosquito County. An act of the Legislative Council on January 29, 1835, made New Smyrna the county seat for Mosquito County. In February 1835, a severe freeze hit the area. Practically all the fruit trees were damaged or destroyed. In December 1835, the second... What'd you say?
But there's never frost in Florida.
Yeah, it happens. In December 1835, the Second Seminole War began, bringing much more death and destruction not only to this area, but to all of Florida. This was not a good year for Florida, 1835. With the close of the Seminole War, some of the citizens returned to Mosquito County, and on February 26, 1842, the Legislative Council approved an act to change the name of Mosquito County to Lee Reed County, after General Lee Reed, a prominent citizen of the area. Hopefully not a Confederate. I missed that detail, but we'll find out. Doesn't seem like he would be, but probably a slave owner. I don't know. The governor, however, never signed this act. The Legislative Council on February 24th, 1843, changed the county seat from New Smyrna to Enterprise. The town was then located about 1 mile east of its present location on Lake Monroe. In January of the same year, Mr. William Fale had been authorized by the legislature to establish a ferry across the St. Johns River between Enterprise and Fort Mellon, now known as Sanford, Florida. On the lower end of Mosquito County was gradually settled. The citizens living in that area complained about the long travel distance from their homes to the county seat and also requested a change in the judicial district. In March 1844, St. Lucie County was established and the requested change in the judicial district was made. The establishment of St. Lucie County put the southern boundary of Mosquito County near the 28th parallel of latitude, or near what is now the southern boundary of present-day Brevard County. This is very far southern Florida. In February 1845, Mosquito County became Orange County, and a few months later, the county seat was moved from Enterprise to Fort Mellon, which, incidentally, by this time, had changed its name to Mellonsville. It might be of interest to note that the act which changed the name to Orange County was an act of the Legislative Council, but the act which moved the county seat to Mellonsville was an act of the state legislature. Territories have legislative councils, but states have legislatures, and between the two actions, Florida had been admitted to the Union on March 3rd, 1845, as the 27th state. So, you see, I know it's kind of dry, but there's like this, I found this like, all this like bureaucratic shuffling to be like kind of hilarious in its own way.
And that fills in a lot of the gaps, well, not the gaps, but it just, again, reinforces, I guess, a lot of what we are going to cover in Chapter 5.
Well, we're going to come up on more of this. This is very much like a teaser for a lot of what's coming.
Yeah, definitely. It's going to cover the Louisiana Purchase and Napoleon's bad faith. And really on all sides, you have Jefferson's bad faith followed by Monroe and Madison's bad faith. And we're going to talk about all those early presidents and their bad faith, essentially.
I got one more paragraph I'm going to read here, and then I'll be done with this. Sorry.
No problem.
But this is, it's like we were talking about with names at the start, where it's like, the thing with Florida is it's like, names are always a tricky business, and people always want things to mean the opposite of what they mean.
Yeah.
So, like,
that talked about the weird and fucked up borders of Florida and the sliding conception of what the Floridas were.
And just like the shifting.
Is it Louisiana that's being purchased? Is it all of the Floridas? I'm not sure.
Right. Volusia County came into being by an act of the legislature in December 1854, which was signed by the governor on December 29th, 1854. This act also made Enterprise the county seat. The agitation among the citizens of this area that led to the formation of Volusia County stemmed from the legislation that in 1846 authorized the clerk of the Circuit Court of Orange and St. Lucie County to keep records, books, and papers of the court at his home. In 1853, when an election had been authorized for the purpose of selecting a site for the county seat, it became obvious that no matter what site was selected, it would be satisfactory for only a small minority. Out of all this came the decision to establish a new county seat on the St. Johns River. Mount Pleasant D. Gold's History of Volusia County, Florida, published in 1927 by Painter Printing Company in DeLand, Florida, contains the most logical explanation for the name of the new county, Volusia. So, the name of the new county was to be Volusia, from the landing on the St. Johns near Lake George. The origin of this word is shrouded in mystery. There are two traditions concerning it. One is to the effect that it is an Indian name, but this is believed to be very doubtful, for the reason that the letter V seldom appears in the words of any Indian language and is in a list of several hundred given in Minnie Moore Wilson's Seminoles in Florida, not one word begins with the letter V. Another tradition is that a Frenchman or Belgian named Veluche, pronounced Veluche, owned a trading post there at one time, some placing it in the English regime, others about 1818. It is claimed that the word Veluche, after long usage, became anglicized into Velusia. Whether or not this is true, there is no record either in the Spanish territorial or county titles of any land being owned at any time in that vicinity or in the county, for that matter, under the name Veluche or any name that resembles it. If such a man held a title under the English regime, there would be no way of ascertaining the fact, as all English titles were denied. So the origin of the name remains a tradition, but it should be given proper consideration, for traditions, after all, is a valuable ally of history. So I just thought, I love that, because I picked this book up just thinking it would be an interesting little peek into the window of Florida history, and it ended up being perfect, because like within the first couple of pages the author is just like, yeah, we don't even Volusia County, we don't know where that word comes from. It might have been some guy who had a general store. We really just like have no fucking idea. So I just thought that was good.
Good.
So
pretty
yeah,
related.
I mean, you got anything else you want to slot in there? I was cutting you off to talk a lot of that. But.
Oh, no problem. No, I think that was a good preview into what's to come. We're going to talk about the weird borders of Florida. We're going to talk about Napoleon's sale to the United States, the era of the English ruling Florida for about 20 years, which turned out to be following a 200-year period of Spain's rule, and then about 20 years of Britain's rule. Then it goes back to Spain, and France is, meanwhile, also, they had lost this territory, obviously, after the massacre that Menendez did, but they end up resettling, obviously, Canada, which is, again, another term like the Floridas that applies to just a broad region. They start settling in the Canada region, and they're the ones who really discover the Mississippi River, not Ponce de Leon, as they work their way south and eventually do even settle into western Florida, where you have Pensacola as the capital, and this is where you have the early formation of East and West Florida. Right. And that becomes critical, that the British, in their short 20-year period, recognized the absurdity of calling this entire region that spanned essentially from Texas all the way to the Carolinas, calling that all one region was impossible to govern, so they divided it into eastern and western Florida based on the earlier influence of French and Spanish cultures that had already formed there, so there were natural fault lines that started to form to create this concept of eastern and western Florida. And I think that's pretty much
well, and for the listener too, like if it ever sounds like we're being repetitive and confusing, we're trying to emphasize and underscore what is essentially a very confusing and also kind of like we said, eternally recurring sort of history, where it's like the same sort of thing keeps happening over and over again. And then it's also like, it is kind of complicated, the whole story of the repeated colonial handoffs of Florida throughout the like 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Like, that is not a very like cut and dry sort of story at all. And I hope that quote I got there about Volusia County helps underscore that too. You know what I mean? It's like there's a lot of lost information here too.
Yeah, and also like that other quote that you brought up earlier towards the end of our reading of chapter 4, where you said that it's not just random disconnected events, but there actually starts to be a pattern. If you don't start with the myth of the Fountain of Youth, but you start with this first slaughter that happened by Menendez, if you start with that as the real starting point of European conquest in Florida, you start to really make a lot more sense of what actually happened, and these events don't just seem like randomly disconnected events. There actually is clearly a pattern, and it's important to understand that all this strange stuff about borders still has a very important effect today. Even in the 2000 election, Allman will talk about how the borders that resulted from East and West Florida still played a major role in the election between George W. Bush and Al Gore.
That's the tease for the next episode, is Florida's joining the Union. So get ready, folks. We're gonna cover the things that lead up to that.
The story and I think the sicko of the America.
Yep, the sicko of the month on this episode too has to be Menendez. Absolute fucking bloodthirsty sicko marching through a hurricane to kill hundreds of Frenchmen. The sicko of the month on the next episode, we're not sure yet, but we're gonna give you a hint. He was strongly associated with a certain type of wood, we'll say. Yes. You might, listeners might know who I'm talking about.
Maybe it's old hickory.
Oh, that's what? What was that? Nope. Okay, we should sign off before you give away all the goods. But if you've made it this far, thank you for listening. We really appreciate you subscribing, because this is a subscriber-only episode. So thank you so much for your patronage. We really do appreciate it so much. You're helping keep our dear producer here well-fed with fresh hay and all that good stuff. He's really he's keeping a roof over. Some fucking nice good oats. Oh my god, that got me. All right, well, let's sign off.
Yeah, sounds good.
Until then, thank you for listening. We'll catch you in the Sunshine State once again.
Yeah, and we'll talk about Chapter 5, the West Florida Butterfly Effect. And that's probably all we'll be able to cover.
Talking butterflies and the Lone Star. Until next time, listener, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
On a paper mache, it's shaped like a fluttering bird. It's on its way. Yeah, it's on its way. When you cast away, will you feel the same? Are you gonna change when you cast away? Yeah.